Okay. Good evening, and thank you very much for coming to SAIS Europe to talk about the regional elections here in Emilia-Romagna. My name is Eric Jones, and I'm Director of European and Eurasian Studies. If I look a little bit strange hiding behind this computer, it's because we're experimenting with new technology that is connecting us to, at least right now, 3 continents. So we've got people watching this event from South Africa, from California, and from Vienna, all because the elections, the regional elections in Emilia-Romagna somehow became the most important elections of the century. At least that's what Gianfranco tells me. Now, obviously, the conversation here is not going to be dominated by me. I'm going to try to moderate the conversation, but the real insights are going to come from my co-panelists. All the way to my left is Gianfranco Pasquino, a man who needs no introduction. I would argue he was my co-editor, which means to say I was his assistant on this giant volume we did, the Oxford Handbook on Italian Politics. He's written a shocking number of books on Italian politics, in addition to having been Senator of the Republic and now emeritus professor at the University of Bologna. He is a SAIS grad, which explains all of that achievement, I think. And we're very fortunate that he could make the time to be here with us. Not a SAIS grad, but we're going to allow him to sit here with us anyway, is Justin Frosini, who's an associate professor up at the University of Bocconi, but who for the last many years has been a loyal colleague directing the Center for Constitutional Studies and Democratic Development here in Bologna, the center that we run together with the University of Bologna. He is a comparative constitutionalist, but he's also one of those rare comparative constitutionalists who gets involved actively in politics. And we thought we would bring him in to get his insights, not just on how Italy has performed, but how we should expect to understand its performance, given the various conversations that we have about constitutional and institutional reform heading forward. Now, you'll notice that these conversations are national conversations and not regional conversations, and yet somehow the national and the regional have all become intertwined, which is why this election in Emilia-Romagna was so important. So I'm going to start there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to invite you guys to ask questions as well. If you get bored before I invite you, you can just put your hand up and I'll let you ask questions even without invitation. We have some colleagues, as I mentioned, who are visiting us from across the globe via the computer. They're allowed to type in questions, so occasionally we'll address their concerns as well. We'll make the conversation as flowing and responsive as possible, but if it goes too fast and you feel like you're getting lost, don't worry, because we're recording this whole event and we're going to host it on YouTube, and you'll be able to watch it again and again and again. Now, having said that, I think we should start with the softball question, and I'm going to pitch it to you, Gianfranco, because I think we all need a little background. A lot of people are here to talk about regional elections. I've never seen that before. Why are people so interested in these elections? What was at stake? How did they become the most important elections of the century?
Thank you, Eric. The question is good. It is important. It reveals something, and not only about the politics of Emilia-Romagna, but about the politics of Italy. Emilia-Romagna has been governed for 50 years by the left, at first by the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, then by the heirs to the Communist Party for a long time, up to now. And the center-right, the Christian Democrats were very weak. The center-right was also very weak. There was never a real challenge to the government by the left in Emilia-Romagna, in the region Emilia-Romagna, and also in the various city governments, with one exception that at the time was Piacenza, but otherwise the left was dominant throughout the region. This was the first time that there was a serious challenge coming from the center-right, from the right, I don't know how to put it more precisely, from the Lega, I would say. I would even be more precise by saying from Salvini himself, because this was Salvini against the rest of the world, in fact, against the left. And this is exactly what he wanted, because he thought he could polarize the competition, and by polarizing the competition, he would probably reach all those who one way or another never liked the governments by the left. On the other hand, the left has been weak for some time in Italian politics. It has reduced, it has seen his trend reduced in Emilia-Romagna. For instance, the candidate of the Lega had been able to bring to the second ballot the mayor of Bologna, the incumbent mayor of Bologna. So the Lega thought that it had a real chance. And Salvini invested all his energies, there are many, all his time in campaigning in Emilia-Romagna. Salvini hoped not only to win in Emilia-Romagna, to have his candidate as the next president of the region, but also to utilize this election to undermine, to sap, can I say to sap? To sap the national government. This was a hope, I mean, technically and constitutionally, but then Justin will tell us more if he wants. Technically, constitutionally, this doesn't make a difference. I tried a sort of very adventurous comparison by saying, well, if the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats lose in Saxony, then the government will not change. But Saxony is not as important as Emilia-Romagna from a symbolic point of view, but also from a real point of view. So this was not the same. Probably the comparison could be with Bavaria. If the Christian Democrats lose Bavaria to the Alternative für Deutschland, that would be probably a blow to the government, to the national government. But still, I do not think that they should change the government. So this was, the meaning was Salvini against the left, Salvini against 70 years of good government, and fundamentally Salvini against the government by the Five Star and the Democratic Party.
So I like this idea of Salvini against everybody, but I am a little bit curious if we don't lose some of the texture by leaving out some of the groups that were implicated as well. And Justin, I want to ask you two different but linked questions. To what extent is this a story about the strength of Salvini or really the weakness of the PD and the divisions within it? And to what extent is this a story about the movement against politics, right? I mean, you know, if I were to talk to international journalists about this election, the first thing they would say is either sardines or five-star movement. The sardines because they showed such a big presence, and the five-star movement because it became so small. So what should we be looking at here?
Well, I think one of the important things to underline is the fact that Salvini tried to turn this into a national election. What we saw on Sunday with the results is that this was a regional election. And there's an old saying in Italian that an old hen makes good broth. And there's no doubt that the people of Emilia-Romagna chose the old hen, and that is the centre-left. They prefer to keep the centre-left in government, and very simply because, on the whole, Emilia-Romagna is governed very well. Bonaccini has been a good president of the region, and despite the weakness of the Democratic Party in Emilia-Romagna and nationally, he was able to, I think, galvanize the voters, convince them that this was an election for the region and to decide who would govern the region in the next 5 years. And from this point of view, he won the elections. Salvini tried to do the exact opposite. He tried to make this regional election a national election. And we had this comical situation, I can't define it any other way, where the actual candidate was Borgonzoni, but most of the time the person that was intervening and giving and rallies and giving talks and so on and so forth was Salvini. He tried to personalize the whole election campaign. I have to be very intellectually honest, because I know Gianfranco otherwise will bring this up. On Friday of last week, we were drinking a coffee early in the morning. I was worried that this technique would work, and actually thought that the Lega and Salvini could win in Emilia-Romagna. So I am actually surprised by the fact that the centre-left not only won, but won with quite a considerable margin. However, I think, thinking about the title also of the seminar, I think this is a setback for Salvini, but it cannot yet be defined as a comeback for the left. And I think the left would make a very, very grave mistake if they think they have suddenly turned things around. Also because the election itself and the results in Emilia-Romagna have to be read very carefully. Gianfranco rightly said that once upon a time, the only area of Emilia-Romagna that wasn't really red was Piacenza, where among other things, Gianfranco was sent to be a candidate many years ago and lost. Yes, he always tells this story. Okay. But now this is not the case. If we look at the map very carefully, we realize that the red is Bologna, Modena, Reggio Emilia, and parts of Romagna. But if we look at it in terms of the actual number of comune, and if we think about it in terms of local elections, if it had been local elections, then the Lega would have won a lot of these comune, at least looking at the results. Then, of course, we have to then see whether at local level we would have then seen good mayors fighting it out and winning those elections. In part, we saw this even last year with European elections and local elections that were held on the same day. The Lega was the first party in the whole of Emilia-Romagna, and yet the same day, the Democratic Party managed to win and to maintain these the cities and the comune that they already governed, apart from the loss of Ferrara in particular. So I think the left would make a grave mistake if they think that this is a comeback. I think they should take this as a moment where they've stopped Salvini. They've shown that there is a way of stopping this wave, but there's a lot to do.
So I want to pivot on some of the things that you've just said there, because I think they are cause for concern. And Gianfranco, I spent a lot of time over the last 2 weeks reading your journal article publications over the last 3 years, and you had a really brilliant piece in 2019 in the Journal of Modern Italian Studies where you lamented the decline of traditional political parties. And in doing so, one of the things that struck me is the center-left got 51% of the vote, but the PD only got 34% of the vote. The split of the vote between the PD and the Lega is 34 to 32. So this is not a huge victory. And if we were to look at the Fratelli d'Italia, they actually do better than any organized group on the center-left outside of the PD. So my question is the center-right actually not winning in terms of organized political movements as opposed to the sort of ad hoc political movements, or am I misinterpreting what these civic lists mean, like Bonaccini per Presidente, that kind of a list?
Well, what is certain is that Salvini has lost. But as Justin rightly said, the left cannot really claim a comeback. It has, in fact, retained the control of the region Emilia-Romagna. It has won more votes than in the past election, but it has not really recovered. Okay? The left is still in a not very good condition. Your question underestimates somewhat the fact that there are very many fragments of the left. That the left in Italy, but probably not only in Italy, we should probably look at France and Spain as well. The left has a tendency to merrily create several minor groups that then worry against each other, and they never really reach an agreement to produce a common front. Okay, so this is the problem of Italy. The problem of Italy is visible in the region Emilia-Romagna as well. The center-right at this point, but here I have one major element that I want to introduce. The center-right at this point is the majority electorate in Italy. However, one should never forget, and again, Justin was right, to say that there are different types of elections, and therefore something different is at stake. What was at stake in Emilia-Romagna was the presidency of the region. Then if you ask me to vote on this, I vote in a certain way. But if you tell me that what is at stake are a couple of seats in the European Parliament, I vote in a slightly different way. And if you ask me to vote for the national government or for the national parliament, then again, it depends very much on the offer. There are not voters at large. There are voters and parties and candidates. So there is a relationship, there is an offer, okay? What do you offer me now for the national parliament? And therefore, quite a number of Italians, and this we know, about 30% of Italians change their vote from one election to the other. And about 20–25% of them are undecided until the very last day of the election. And indeed, I would probably add that Salvini made a couple of mistakes, major mistakes, in the final week of the campaign. And those who had been undecided up to the point decided that they could not vote for Salvini also because of those mistakes. So national elections are not here to come, and then it very much will depend from the alignment, from the offers, from the candidates as well.
So I want to actually, I need to turn off.
Are you right?
I want to come back to this issue of national elections, but I still want to dig a little bit into the results of the elections that we just had. Justin, I guess if we were looking for a good news story, the good news story would be that affluenza, that the participation rates were much higher this time around than they were in the recent European elections, than they were in the previous regional elections. I mean, much, much higher. An increase of over 30%. So do we think that that's a good thing, or do we worry with Gianfranco that this is just a sign of a different kind of volatility? We get net vote change from one election to the next, but we also get huge fluctuations in participation rates.
Actually, I think we need to be careful with the issue of turnout, because it is true that if we compare the turnout for the regional elections on Sunday with 5 years ago, there is an enormous difference. But we shouldn't forget the elections of 5 years ago were elections that Bonaccini won in a very serious situation of corruption scandals. There were issues with regard to the reimbursements that regional councillors had obtained. The previous president had to resign, and there was a lot of voter apathy from that point of view. So the turnout is high, but if we compare it with other regional elections, it wasn't a massive turnout. And that I think is important. I don't want to enter into the terrain of political scientists and those that study electoral flows and so on and so forth, but some say that if the turnout had been in the 70s, then maybe the result might have been slightly different. So I wouldn't give too much emphasis to the increase in turnout. Certainly, having said that, there are a whole series of episodes that have certainly galvanized the centre-left voters. I am not of the opinion that there is one cause for the result of this election. I don't usually believe in monocausal explanations. There are all sorts of things that I think tip the balance one way or the other. The sardines movement, I think that was one cause. It's not the only. Anyone that thinks it's only thanks to the sardines that the centre-left won, I think they're wrong. There's also the good government of the region. That's another reason why a lot of voters went to vote, because they had no idea what Borgonzoni would be like as a president. And let me underline this. I think this needs to be underlined very clearly. I don't think there was any sexism whatsoever in underlining the incompetence of the candidate of the centre-left. It had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that she was a woman. It was simply because most people felt that she was not good enough for the position that she was running for. If there was anyone that was sexist, if I may say, it was Salvini, constantly talking over her, replacing her and substituting her all the time, because he probably feared that she would not give good speeches and would, on the whole, demonstrate her incompetency. So, yeah, and he was probably right. Then, of course, there is the last the last week of the election campaign, the famous doorbell in the Pilastro going ringing in the house of a Tunisian family and asking them whether there was someone in the family that was a drug dealer. Okay, I think this certainly did not help. Again, it's not the only cause for Salvini's defeat, but this worried everyone. It worried me. I thought, good God, I hope he doesn't start ringing my doorbell and coming up and wanting to see me. You know, it really did seem like a gross fire, apart from the legal implications, which we will see develop in the next few weeks. But just the idea of this violation of one's privacy, yeah, I think he just went too far. Kissing prosciuttos, eating tortellini. Among other things, he needs to be careful, and I can say this as someone that has put on a lot of weight since living in Emilia-Romagna. He needs to lose a little bit of weight, because I think he spent too much time drinking Lambrusco and eating tortellini. So I think he just went that step too far, and that's all right. Then, of course, we have not talked about the Movimento Cinque Stelle, but that will probably be for another question.
Okay, Gianfranco, another question for you. What about the Movimento Cinque Stelle? Where did those guys go? And more important, how important was this election for them internally, given that Luigi Di Maio resigned just before the vote took place?
Let me add one thing to what Justin just said, that indeed there are many causes, or if you want, many conditions that can explain Salvini's defeat. One of them was that really he overdid it, I will put it this way. There was an exaggeration. That is, I don't know, what would Salvini ask you if he rings your doorbell? What kind of question you would not like to answer? But the point is that he also lost in Bibbiano, where there was a problem with children, the way the bureaucracy of the local organization was in fact convincing or constraining the parents to allow the children to be given to other families and so on. And in Bibbiano, the Lega and the candidate lost in a very significant way, okay? Which means, of course, that the voters reacted. This is the point I'm making. The voters reacted to what they saw, what they heard, what was taking place, and what Salvini was doing. The night of the election, usually, I remember in Britain as well as in the US, the losing candidates concede, is it correct? Concede the elections. Who was conceding the loss or the victory? Who was conceding? Salvini. The Borgonzoni was not on stage. She was simply not there. And he delivered a long speech explaining why and so on, of course, saying that after all, this was a very good defeat, that in fact it was a defeat resembling a victory. Okay. Well, the Movimento Cinque Stelle cannot concede defeat, because it probably should concede that it is on its way to disappearing, okay? Because it was, first of all, not really convinced that he had to be present in Emilia-Romagna, which is a mistake. Because if you are a political organization, you must be present when there are elections. Second, because in Emilia-Romagna, the movement started its trajectory. Because in the square of Bologna, Grillo launched, in fact, the movement. And in Emilia-Romagna, they won the first mayor in Parma. So they had a presence. They were, in fact, representing several sectors of the dissatisfied left. Okay? And indeed, if you look at the flows of voters, it seems that 2/3 of the voters who had voted for the Movimento a few years ago decided to support Bonaccini, not necessarily to support the PD, but to support Bonaccini. And only 1/3 divided between staying home and giving the vote to Salvini, because Salvini does represent some dissatisfaction with the political system. But if they proceed this way, they will simply disappear.
So that's that vote flux, I think, is interesting and reflects also one of the elements of institutional design in the region that I wonder if you could help me unpack. when I look at the votes that the Five Star Movement received, Justin, about 4.3% of the electorate voted Five Star for the assembly, but only about 3% voted for the Five Star candidate for president. So to what extent was the ability to vote a split ballot where you vote for one president that you think is competent, somebody like Bonaccini, and yet a regional representation that reflects your ideological perspective, to what extent was that influential in this contest, or is that even something that we could use to interpret the results after the fact?
I think it was important, but not as important as many thought it might be. I think the whole issue of split voting was a bit like the whole issue of tactical voting in the British election on the 12th of December. There was some tactical voting, there was some split voting, but I don't think it was decisive. I haven't looked at the specific figures, but I don't think there was a lot of split voting among centre-right voters who were voting for one of the lists of the centre-right and then voting for Bonaccini, which was really would have been the issue. Whereas for the Movimento Cinque Stelle, I completely agree with what Gianfranco was saying. I mean, they made the terrible mistake of not choosing these elections. The institutional framework and the elections lead to a bipolar system. Fundamentally, you have to choose one side or another. They decided after the result in Umbria, which was completely different context with respect to the elections in Emilia-Romagna, they decided not to support Bonaccini, and we can see the result. They managed to put together just over 5% as a list, but even nearly half those that voted the list voted for Bonaccini as president, and a lot simply did not vote for the Five Star Movement and voted directly for one of the parties and lists of the centre-left coalition. From this point of view, I have to say, going back to one of your earlier questions, Erik, I think that Bonaccini was actually very intelligent in the way that he put his coalition together as well. You had the Democratic Party, you had a more reformist, progressive party led by Eli Schlein. There was another smaller civic list, and then there was the list of the president, which was actually, with 5.6, I think, a very successful result, with an interesting person at the top of the list, Mauro Fellicori, who got quite a lot of preferences. So I think the way that the coalition was put together was very good. And I would hazard to say that from Bonaccini's point of view, I think it was a good thing that the Five Star Movement did not decide to join the coalition. I think he might even have lost some votes. Allow me one last thing. I think Luigi Di Maia's decision to resign a few days before the elections was an act of total cowardice. That was a way of, he was a coward, yeah. That was a way of getting out of the situation of having to admit on Sunday night or early Monday morning that the Movimento Cinque Stelle had lost. We have not had a press conference on the part of the Five Star Movement sort of explaining what had happened. From this point of view, I agree with Gianfranco when he says that it was Salvini that gave the concession speech and not Borgonzoni. However, even there, in terms of communication, that was quite a savvy move by Salvini, because it always, I think, looks good, whoever has lost, to go out there, give a press conference and say, okay, we lost. I think it always looks good among the voters. From this point of view, the Five Star Movement non ha fatto una bella figura, as the Italians would say.
So that's an interesting point that you're making, Justin, and it makes it easy to pivot from the regional contest to the national implications, because we know that in March, the Five Star Movement is going to have some kind of meeting where it decides what its organizational structure is going to look like. Gianfranco, I guess my question for you is, should we be worried looking ahead to that March meeting that the Five Star Movement as a political entity might lose the cohesion that it needs in order to operate effectively in a national coalition government? Or is there a real political risk that the coalition government could collapse because of the consequences of this vote, but also because of the internal incoherence that the Five Star Movement carries with it?
I have to control my feelings, my expectations, and my hopes.
and try to provide a sort of rational answer to all this. Why should be we worried? I mean, we ought to be worried if we think that this will have an impact on the government, and if you believe that a yellow, pink government is preferable to a green government, which is green, but not in fact in favor of protecting the environment and so on and so on. I don't think that they are so crazy, even though they have already made several mistakes, so crazy as to change the government or create problems for the government such that they would lead to early elections. In Parliament, there is now a numerical majority. The numerical majority is quite a number of five-star deputies and senators, more five-star deputies and senators than PD deputies and senators. It is in their interest to last as long as they can. There are two important dates. One of them is the election of the President of the Republic, that is January 2022. And if they lose the elections, we will have for the first time a president elected by the center right. So I think that they are not so crazy as to produce a governmental crisis. The second is that most of them, if they indeed implement their charter, or as they would say, their non-charter, cannot be re-elected because they established a two-term limit for those elected to parliament, and many of them, Di Maio included, could not be re-elected. So there is a second element which is important. On the other hand, the President of the Republic is willing to allow this parliament to continue, provided that the numerical majority is also a political majority capable of producing something. Because if the government does not produce, then the President of the Republic will be unwilling to allow the government to continue without doing anything. And there is stagnation is not the answer to the problems of the country, or for the matter to the problems of the five-star movement. But if the question is whether they are capable of renewing themselves, then the answer is it will be very, very difficult. Because part of the dissatisfaction and of the irritation of the Italian against the government, against parliament, against politics, has been in a way appropriated by the Lega. The Lega is at the same time capable of saying that it is indeed a party providing good government, because after all, it governs several, the most important regions, with a couple of exceptions. And second, it is still criticizing the politics, the way parliament works and so on. So it is capable of obtaining votes from those who like to have stable governments, Veneto, Lombardy, Piedmont to some extent, and other areas. It has conquered all the regions up to now where the vote has been taken, and at the same time criticizing all this. And so it would be very risky for the five-star movement not to try to reorganize itself. This cannot be done by Di Maio. Di Maio has proved to be quite inadequate. And I believe that within the Five Stars movement there are interesting persons capable of organizing, reorganizing the movement, but it will not be easy at all.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned this thing about the two-term limit in the five-star movement. I actually went through their whole group of senators and counted out which ones were in their second term. And when I was doing the math, there were 101 five-star movement senators, of whom 18 were doing their second term in the Senate, and 4 had done a prior term in the Chamber of Deputies, which still counts according to the rules. And I guess my question for you, Justin, is, if these guys can do the deal with Salvini, wouldn't it make sense for them to leave in the middle of this second term and get a safe seat from Salvini? And the reason I ask that question is because in December, Stefano Lucidi, who looked at the regional electoral results in Umbria, made precisely that calculation, jumped from five-star movement straight to Salvini in the second term of his mandate with the five-star movement. And it seems like a reasonable calculation to make. Having said that, and this is another aspect of the question that I need you to help us with, I understand that we're about to lose a significant number of members of parliament as we drop down to only 200 members of the Senate and 400 of the Chamber of Deputies. To what extent does that kind of a constitutional reform influence the way the political parties might be thinking, or not the parties, rather the individuals who are looking to keep the positions that they have in politics?
Let me start with the second part of your question, i.e. the constitutional reform, which reduces the number of senators and deputies. First and foremost, allow me to say this as a constitutionalist. This is a constitutional reform which is solid gold populism, because to simply propose the reduction of the number of senators and deputies without taking into account all the effects that this would have on the rest of the system, including the election of the President of the Republic, including the internal regulations of the two chambers, and so on and so forth, is, in my opinion, absurd. And I've no problem in saying that I have signed against this reform, and sincerely hope that in the referendum the no's will prevail. But I think I am a very, very small majority, okay? And I have a feeling small minority. Okay, if I'm a small majority, I'll be very pleased about that. Okay, wishful thinking, exactly. So as that's a premise, and I think that is the referendum will be on the 29th of March. I think that is pretty decisive with respect to your first part of the question, Erik, because if, and it's highly likely, this reduction takes place, then unfortunately for Salvini and the centre-right, they don't have a lot of safe seats to offer the other side, okay? So I think this will actually limit floor crossing and the capability of convincing a certain number of members of the five-star movement from switching sides, hoping to be assured a safe seat in the next elections and bringing down the government. This is something we have seen in the past. This is a method that Berlusconi used to bring down a second Prodi government, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that if this reform, that's probably one of the few positive things about the reform, is that it will leave little space for offering seats to the other side, because the centre-right themselves will have to decide how they're going to distribute the seats. And then I have to open this up. Sorry, this is a country that talks about the manager of the football team and electoral systems all the time. Of course, we have to see what electoral system will be introduced. Okay, it looks as if this government is going to introduce a system of pure proportional representation, maybe with a 5% threshold. Now, I am not going to comment on the incoherence of certain people in the Democratic Party and in Italia Viva with regard to this, who were supposedly all supporters of a majority system and now suddenly decide that it would be much better to have proportional representation. However, I'm wondering whether the Democratic Party might start having second thoughts after the results of the elections in Emilia-Romagna, which is, if you think about it, the way that the president is elected is a majority system, because whoever gets the majority wins the presidency. And it looks like, at least in Emilia-Romagna, that we've gone back to a bipolar system. If I were in the Democratic Party, I would think twice about going back to pure proportional representation with a threshold. But that's another issue. If I were in the five-star movement, quite frankly, I'd be quite worried, because I think they are politically all over the place, and there are a whole series of issues that this government has to deal with. One is the so-called statutes of limitations. This is an issue. Okay, it sounds very technical. It sounds like something that's just related to the reform of the justice system, but it isn't. It is a very important issue. If the reform of the Minister of Justice Bonafede goes through, I think this will be quite serious in terms of how our justice system works, because Italy has a problem of trials that last too long, and the reform that Bonafede is proposing, I just think, goes against a civil idea of justice in a country. Then there are the issue of the state concessions, thinking about the Atlantean Autostrade, Benetton. Again, I don't think it's a very good idea to propose taking those concessions away. The problem with issues like the bridge in Geneva and so on and so forth isn't so much the concessions in themselves, but the problem that there isn't a proper system of control. And that is what the government should be trying to deal with. Okay, introducing proper authorities that can control the way that these concessions work, not simply, and again, in a populist manner, saying, oh, let's take the concessions away. That's easy, but we'll end up in the courts for the next 10 years if we do something like that, because obviously Benetton, Atlantia, and all the other companies that have these concessions will immediately go to the courts because they will say that there is a violation of the contracts that they signed. Then there are issues such as the reform of the pension system, and last but not least, whether to maintain the minimum income, reddito di cittadinanza. Here, I think it is very enlightening to see, we haven't talked about the result in Calabria, but the fact that the five-star movement in Calabria got less votes than the number of people that in Calabria now have minimum income, thanks to the reform of the five-star movement, who, let us not forget, were over 40% just a few months or a year ago. I think that is a startling result.
This story about Calabria underscores the point, Gianfranco, that you made about electoral volatility. I guess my concern with that point is that the electoral volatility is all about just sort of throwing the bums out. And I wonder if we're not seeing a new cleavage emerge alongside this electoral volatility. And the reason I say that is because I did one of those nice regressions where I looked at the European elections and the level of support for the Lega versus the PD as a function of the size of the electoral community, the number of people who voted in a particular district. And what you find very clearly is that small communities vote overwhelmingly Lega with Stalinist majorities, not to mix metaphors here. And I worry that the Lega is embedding itself as the political party that represents rural, small communities, and that we're going to see this happening across the country, including in places like Calabria. And so I guess my question is, you know, yes, we're seeing volatility, but is the volatility all restricted to big urban electorates that tend to vote center-left, and less volatility in the rural right-wing electorates that could be dependent upon to deliver time and again seats to a prospective center-right majority?
I think that that is the left, or the center left, being strong in urban areas, and the right, the center right, even the extreme right, being strong in rural areas, is probably a general phenomenon in the world today. I'm still criticizing those in the urban areas of north of England for voting for Brexit, while we know that London, which apparently is an urban area, voted in favor of staying within Europe. And this apparently is the same in Germany as well. These urban areas are largely left-wing areas, and rural areas are largely center-right areas. Can we, in a way, find a remedy for all this? It is clear that there is the possibility of doing that. And the possibility is that finally the left, and in this particular case it will be the Partito Democratico, because only the Partito Democratico can mobilize enough activists, tries to reach out to what we call, in fact, the peripheries, okay? And this is important, and it can be done. To some extent, this is what Bonaccini did. It is true that he did not, in fact, penetrate all the rural areas, but he succeeded in stopping the outflow of votes by going to remote rural areas. And this can be done. It can be done, first of all, by having a different kind of politics, but also by having a different kind of policies as well. because we have in Italy, and probably in other areas as well, or in other areas of the world, to some extent underestimated the impact of these inequalities. And inequalities are not, in fact, necessarily just economic inequalities, are social inequalities. That is, those who feel left behind, not necessarily because they cannot survive, but because they are not taken seriously. Their demands are not considered important. Well, after all, you live in a small town in the Apennines, and therefore you are not so important. And therefore we do not really organize a school, we do not provide you with the health services and so on. And so I would say this is a problem not necessarily of economic inequality, but let me put it this way, of inequality of opportunities. Okay? You have a more difficult life. And this is what the left has to a large extent underestimated. This, by the way, is what the Five Stars movement, in fact, utilized to acquire some consensus. The minimum income, as you say, has been important. I would, if I were a five-star spokesman, I would say that this was, in fact, a success to a large extent. And what you can do is you can improve on this, but you should not abandon that. Let me just say a minor point. I do not want to criticize Justin, but the statute of limitations is a law. So now you have to change the law. It's not that you wait for the approval. And this, in fact, was another of those populist, can I say, creation in a way. And this is something, incidentally, that on which there is no, I mean, say, popular majority, because it is a difficult issue to deal with. Because we know, for instance, that can I say, I don't know how to put it, because Berlusconi utilized it repeatedly. Out of 9 trials, 7 of those trials ended because of the statutes of limitations. So there are good reasons to say, well, we have to in fact, try to conduct the trial up to its very end, and not allow those who are in a way responsible for wrongdoing to be freed because of the statute of limitations. No?
We have a question that's come in from Stanford. So Veronica says it's great to see you guys again. And she says, how do you think that these elections affect European politics more broadly? Could they be used as some kind of symbolic anti-nationalism victory? The reason she's asking, she says, is because it doesn't feel like anybody is doing that, right? It feels like the elections were really big before, but now from a European perspective, they've all but vanished. I mean, is there any sense in which the pro-European Europe is missing another chance to benefit from political developments in Italy, as opposed to just ignoring those developments when they don't fit the narrative they're trying to sell?
Yeah, I think we are losing an opportunity from this point of view, because if on one hand I said at the beginning, the left should not think that this is a comeback and start celebrating in the streets and so on and so forth. Veronica's question is interesting, because looking at it from a European perspective, people in Europe should be underlining this is the results that you get in a region that uses over 80% of European funding. Because Emilia-Romagna is one of the most efficient regions in Italy for using the funding it receives. This is a big problem that this country does not talk about enough. Italy and the Italian regions, including Calabria and so on, receive a lot of funding from the European Union, but they are incapable of spending this money. And this is one of the big differences between those regions in Italy that are governed well, and that they're not only centre-left, they're also centre-right regions, but in particular Emilia-Romagna is at the top in terms of the use of European funding. So this would be a simple message that you could send in terms of connecting regional elections to the European question and saying, that's it, that's what you get. That's why you get good governance when European funds are used in a certain way? That's a quick answer that I'll give to that question.
So Gianfranco, just because I can't resist the temptation, since you guys were talking about the statute of limitations, all I kept thinking was, wait a minute, wasn't that guy Renzi talking about this issue and making a big deal out of it? And yet he seemed relatively silent in the regional contest. So I guess my question is, was Italia Viva a good move in terms of consolidating a more centrist version of the left and mobilizing a new voice in the political conversation, or has that simply aggravated the factionalism that you described earlier in your comments?
In discussing Renzi, I'm never at my best, I must say. Renzi provokes in me usually negative reactions. And in this particular case, he was not present because some of its, how can I say, affiliates decided not to be present, but because of probably because he also feared that the center-left might have lost the elections, and therefore he would be in a way considered part of those who have lost, okay? Renzi doesn't like to be on the part of those who lose. As we know, he's a bad loser, I would also add. And so this is why he was not here. Now, in any case, he will have to be present in Tuscany. Okay, this is important. The second element to deal with when speaking of Renzi is that is in the government. Okay, and here the timing is important because he, in a way, helped, probably Justin would say, masterminded the creation of this government. He allowed and he wanted to have ministers in the government, under secretaries, and after all this had been completed, he produced a split. Okay, and so now he has, how do you say, the winning card. He can use the card if he wants at any point in time. He can, in fact, ruin the government. I cannot put it in English, and you translate it. Instead of piccolo cabotaggio, that is when you use your small boat